Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk. Thanks for expressing interest in Node.js and Selenium WebDriver testing. It's something I've been interested in. Well, testing in general is something I've been interested in for a long time, and Selenium since Selenium 1.0. And I got the opportunity to build this framework, I think, based on people. When I kind of take a long view of it and look back at the last few years. So what I wanted to do in this talk was focus on these people who I've worked with at PayPal. These are all PayPals, or were at one point, if some of them maybe have moved on. And there's others as the talk goes on. And we'll get to Darth Maul. He's a specific person I didn't want to unmask, let's say. I want to talk about Nemo. I want to talk about Node.js and Selenium WebDriver, but I really want to do it through the lens of all these people. If you want to poke around while I'm talking, if you have your laptop and you're one of those people that likes to install stuff and mess around since NPM is so quick, you can go to the Nemo example app and clone that and take a look at some of the sort of latest stuff that I'm working on. And the latest stuff is around Selenium 3. And Node 7. So I'm trying to replace what we're doing with the promise manager with what you can do with async and await. And a lot of the examples are going to reflect that as we move through some example slides. That's me. So I'm the manager of the Node infrastructure team at PayPal, and my team isn't specifically responsible for testing. We're responsible for everything that a developer needs to build a Node.js application at PayPal. So it really encompasses a lot of stuff. And Nemo is not, necessarily the only thing that my team manages. So we're a really busy team and a fairly small team, but we love what we work on. Node.js at PayPal, I think, is a really exciting place to be. And it's, every day is really busy, but I love to go to work there with the people that I work with. And I came to Node.js from web development, so I don't have a specific CS background. I majored in math. And I just kind of got into web development, and then through my interest in JavaScript, I ended up as a Node.js developer. So Node.js has allowed a lot of developers that I know at PayPal to get into this full stack developer space. And just to mention one person, Bob Rigel took that headshot for me, and I've been using it because it's high definition. Why not? So Node.js, how did it get to PayPal? It got there because of these three people. And Eric Toth is on the right. He said I could just use his Space Kitty avatar, so I did. But Bill Scott, Jeff Harrell, and Eric Toth came to PayPal around 2011. Actually, Jeff Harrell was returning to PayPal. And they were coming from Netflix, and their charter was to change the development culture at PayPal. And the vehicle for doing this turned out to be Node.js. And in 2012, the framework that was built to do that, the Express-based framework called Kraken, was open sourced. And after that time, and I actually ended up on a team with Jeff and Eric. After that time, the next year or so was really this blizzard of just going to conferences, talking, introducing Kraken, and really, putting the word out about Kraken. And in that same time frame is when I started to work on Nemo. And at this point, it's in, I don't necessarily want to call it maintenance mode because there's still a lot of active development going on in Kraken, but there's new apps spinning up every week on the Kraken platform, and it's pretty exciting. So why test in Node.js? Before bringing Nemo online in around 2012, most of the Selenium testing was done in Java, and I was working on more unit testing based tools for JavaScript. And when I saw that there was a Selenium WebDriver module, I thought, well, why don't we let people test in JavaScript, because then they could import modules from their application if they needed to. They don't have to context switch. They can use NPM and whatever command line tools they're using for their development in their testing as well. So it made sense to try and get something happening in Node.js as well. And that's sort of what motivated the idea of like building something. And my first users of sort of the very alpha thing that I built was Prakash Shakya and Vidya Aravind. And we did a 24-hour hackathon together, the three of us, and we used what was not called Nemo yet to automate several browsers and some Sauce Labs automation and some device simulators on the desktop. So because of that work of the three of us, it really started to move things forward. It started to bring on board some testers to see that JavaScript was a viable language. And it gave me a lot of insight into what needed to be done to build out a full-featured framework. Also, Nemo was heavily inspired by what was already at PayPal, which was, I'm trying to remember the name before, but CLion. It's open source to CLion. And Doug Simmons. So I had a lot of conversations with Doug about Selenium in general and CLion specifically to, understand what we needed to do to make a successful framework for Node.js. And he's a committer to the project, and I think of him as my Selenium big brother because he comes to my desk and tells me when there's stuff I need to know about Selenium that I don't keep track of. So, it's good to have Doug around. And if you're testing in Java, I strongly recommend that you check out CLion to see if it's suitable for what you're doing. So here's the Nemo website. And I didn't make it. I made a website before this that was much less attractive than this. And it was made by Walmik Deshpande. And he's just a guy that works at PayPal. And he came to me one day and he's like, hey, I built a website. You want to see it? You can have it. That's kind of the open source thing, right? So here's Walmik, and here's some artwork that he made for the website. And again, with people, I couldn't have done that on my own, and I didn't ask anybody to do it. He just, out of the goodness of his heart, and because he could and was good at it, he went ahead and did that. And I, wanted to thank him out in the open here. And in terms of taking stuff open source at PayPal. If you've ever tried to get something open sourced from within a corporate environment, you know that it's not necessarily simple. There's legal hurdles you have to get through. There's structural hurdles within maybe your organization where your manager or your manager's manager doesn't think it's important to work on open source. At PayPal, we have an open source office, and it's run by Danese Cooper. And Duane O'Brien is on her team. There's other people on her team as well, but these are the two people I interact with most. And they're just brilliant at open source software. Duane does this thing called the Open Source Jam, where every quarter he asks people to just do something for open source, and if you do it, you get a T-shirt. So I got my T-shirt from a few quarters ago. But they're really trying to get open source happening at PayPal, even if it's not specifically a product that we're pushing out. They just want developers that go into the open source community and do stuff. And also, who knows who Wavy Gravy is? Has anybody ever heard of Wavy Gravy? I met Wavy Gravy because Denise took me and some other open source contributors to his summer camp, and that's just one of those intangible things that you can't, I don't know, it's just, It seems like it has nothing to do with programming, but it's made me a happier programmer just knowing these people and kind of going through the process with them. So here's my joke slides. So when you release and promote open source software, when you build something at your desk and you think it's wonderful, you go out and start talking about it and giving trainings on it, and you think this is great. Everybody's going to use this, and we're going to be super productive. So. A little further down the line, when people start using your software and they're like, hey, it doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? It worked perfectly when we did the training. Well, you get into this cycle of like, oh my gosh, people are having problems with what I'm building. And then you get into this maintenance loop, and it feels like this. And this is the real world. And this is where I spend most of my time, which I frankly don't mind at all. I like helping people. I like the idea of support and maintenance. Some people will build something and they'll move on, and then there's someone like me that comes along and says, I'm going to pick this up and I'm going to make sure it works for the next X years. So I think it takes both kinds of engineers to make things happen. Okay, so what is Nemo? This is my take on what the environment looks like. You've got Selenium WebDriver on the left, and then on the right you've got whatever you're trying to automate, and then in the middle you've got some intermediary. And the stuff on the right I still regard as a bit of magic, which is fine, right? That's how APIs are. You call them, they do their thing. So Selenium WebDriver sets capabilities, can locate the intermediary. It has the WebDriver API, and it allows you to execute commands. And then, you've got your Firefox driver, Gecko driver, et cetera, Appium, cloud service, whatever it might be. And then on the far right, you've got whatever it is you're actually trying to automate. So to drill in on Selenium WebDriver, just to show you where Nemo fits into this, Nemo wraps it. So Selenium WebDriver is a direct dependency of Nemo. Nemo allows you to author plugins, and it also allows you to configure. So this is the plugin that I wrote, nemo-view, which is a view abstraction, which allows you to define your locators in JSON and then use them within your test or wherever you're automating. And then on top of that, you would have some sort of test runner. Mocha is the one that most people use. Other people might use Cucumber, Jasmine, or Tape. Even most people that I work with use Mocha, so I focus a lot of my examples on Mocha, and we'll see that later on. And then on top of that, you might use yet another abstraction, like a grunt or a gulp or something else that allows you to run your tests in a variety of environments. And I've been recently working on something called Nemo Runner, which I'm going to demo a little bit later, which I hope is going to take some of the confusion out of running in different environments and doing things like parallel executions. And then the gray bar, other plugins, that was my open space to say, okay, who's going to come in and build something else? I built a bit of an environment here, so what are we going to do to fill this out? Before we get that far, let me talk about configuration. That's the other major value add that I think Nemo puts on top of Selenium WebDriver. So you can use config files. You have config.json would have your basic configuration, and then other config files could be pulled in based on the node-env environment variable. And then there are these things called short-stop handlers in the configuration engine, which we'll look at what they do in a minute. They basically allow you to pull dynamic data into your JSON configuration as you're resolving it. So some of the handlers are env, argv, path, and import, which are fairly self-explanatory, I think, and you'll see as we get into it a bit. So if you're going to use Nemo, you have to define config.json, and this is the basic of what you need. You just need to define a browser. So this, if you have this as your config file, you can do something. You can at least run Firefox. And the additional configuration optional stuff is plugins, data, and profiles is a new one. That's new as of this Nemo Runner thing that we're going to talk about in a bit. And you can see there's an import handler there, and that's going to pull in JSON from yet another file. So this is a way that you don't have to put everything in one file, although you could. And this is what the Nemo constructor looks like. So since the configuration is defined elsewhere, all you have to do is instantiate it, and then you've got the WebDriver, and you've got whatever Nemo objects that you've got based on your configuration. So there's no idea of browser or capabilities in this test because that's all defined via your configuration. And this is what a plugin configuration might look like, and these are the three that we're going to see a little bit later. There's nemo-view, nemo-page, which was authored by someone else who we'll meet later, and WDB, which is the WD bridge, which allows you to use the WD WebDriver from within Nemo. So it's kind of a weird thing. If you want to use Appium, you can actually use WD from within Nemo and then automate through Appium. So here's a quick demo of the configuration. So just really briefly, if you're in a Node.js project, you could have Nemo in your package.json, and that's all you'd need just to get started. And this is the 3.0 alpha that I'm working on right now. And I'm drilling into the configuration folder. And by default, the configuration engine is going to look for this config file, config.json. And there's your minimal config that says, let's launch Firefox. And then, in addition, here's your plugin configurations for these three, which again are all optional. And normally you'd use view or page. You wouldn't probably use both. But this is an example app. So this is the data section, and this is some URL for a local application, so localhost, so you're testing locally. And then there's the file that we're importing that we'll get to later. But just going back to this data section, let's say that we go to CI and on Jenkins, we don't have something running on localhost. We actually have a deployed application that we're testing against. So we'd want to define the base URL differently. And the rest of this configuration is the same, but just because of the environment that you're in, you get that one value that's overridden. So it's sort of like a deep merge of the objects. And that's one of the dimensions of configuration that you can get using Nemo. OK, I believe that's the end of that one. OK, so I wanted to talk about some patterns and introduce some more people who've worked on these. There's Nemo and Cucumber. Does anybody here use Cucumber to do BDD? OK, yeah. And then there's nemo-fixo. Fixo is a fixture sort of data-driven testing module that was written by someone who we'll meet later. Nemo and Sauce Labs, Nemo plus WD plus Appium, Nemo plus Nemo page, and then Nemo plus Nemo view. So Nilesh Kulkarni is probably the most active contributor besides myself on Nemo, and he was working out of the Boston office, and he would go and give talks about Nemo and Cucumber, and he did a lot of code reviews and pull requests into the main module, so I really wanted to give him a shout out. So he's the one that wrote a lot of the examples around using Nemo with Cucumber. So for those who use Cucumber, this would look familiar. It's a Cucumber feature described in a BDD style language. And this is the actual functionality where he's using nemo-view to do some automation. So I'm not going to go line for line, obviously, but you can see nemo.view.paypal registration is the view object that he's using, and you can see the synchronous type code, which would indicate that we're using Selenium WebDriver and the Promise Manager. And this is Herianto Siatono, and he works in Singapore. And he created this module called nemo-fixo. It's a plugin for Nemo. And I will admit that I don't know how it works. But that's the beauty of creating an ecosystem, is that things can grow and live in that ecosystem. You don't necessarily, the author doesn't necessarily need to know exactly how it works. But his team has an extensive suite using nemo-fixo. And basically, it's like you define your fixture as a JSON file. And there's overrides that allow you to test by country dimension or by user dimension or credit card dimension, any number of dimensions. And this is just it's kind of a quick pseudocode of something you might be able to do with it. And again, I'm not going to dive into it very deeply, but if you're doing data-driven type testing, it's something that you might want to look into. And it's definitely something I'd like to generate better examples and screencast videos from, so that one, so I understand it better, and two, so that we can hopefully get other people to use it. And Nemo with Sauce Labs, the people who have done a lot of mobile testing using Nemo and Sauce Labs, and WD and Appium actually, is Lucy Zhao, Matul Patel, and Nishanti Yuvaraj, and they all work on the same team together, and they've come with questions periodically to me, but mostly they work on their own, so they've built up a lot, again, on their own. And this is just a quick, just a few snippets of code that they've generated. So they're using a data-driven module, which it's open source. It's not a PayPal open source, but you can use it with Mocha. Excuse me. And you can see they've got these tags in their test, which is something a lot of people who use Mocha use. They use the tags so they can grep out various tests. And you can see they're accessing the Nemo config. They're getting a Sauce variable, and they're testing and doing something if it's an Android browser. So they're basically duck typing for an Android use case. And then if we dig into one of their actually definition files, I think this is from navigate.js, you can see the Nemo commands. And again, they're using nemo.view.self-help unified login page. So they're using nemo-view, so there's a JSON file under there that's creating these definitions. And then I added that comment there. I said recommend deterministic wait, because I was kind of, whenever I see a driver.sleep, I'm like, ooh, just a little. So this is Barry Dutton. He's probably with Nilesh, they're kind of equal in terms of how much time they've spent on Nemo and helping support the Nemo community within PayPal. And he didn't, I don't want to say he didn't like, but he saw the lack of a page object type of abstraction for Nemo. So he wrote one. He wrote Nemo Page as a plugin. So with Nemo Page, you would define some JSON object that would be a page. And this is just a part of this account.json file. But it defines card as a model. And then you can see that number is basically a text input and type is a select or a drop-down input. And Nemo Page out of the box allows you to define things like text boxes and select elements. And then you can also define your own types. So if you have some other sort of thing that's not just your basic form element, you can define a model like that. So this is what a test would look like if you're using Nemo Page. So you can see there's the set value. You're doing a card.setValue, and you're passing in an object to the setValue method. And then right after that, we're doing a card.collect, and the collect is how you grab data off of the page. So you can see I've kind of worked this up a little bit to use the async await functionality that's available where we start to get away from the promise manager. And I wasn't really bothered by putting await keywords in front of everything. Again, if you compare that to chaining promises, it's certainly a lot better. And then as we see later, we can step through on the debugger, and that works pretty well. So the next abstraction is nemo-view, which is the one I wrote. It's more flat. It doesn't think of things in terms of pages. It's just more in terms of locators or sections of a page. So you just would have a flat list of locators. And by default, you can use CSS locators because as a web developer, I find those to be the most accessible for me. But you could also use XPath or whatever else. And what you get back if you define a JSON object like this from nemo-view is you get back a lot of methods based on those locators. So for example, the bank number, the account number, will give you all these methods that you can use to access the web element and also test for its presence or see if it's visible or not. And if it happens to be a drop-down, you can set its value based on text or value. So for any one of your locators, you get this set of methods. And this is what a spec would look like using nemo-view. So the funky one, using WD within Selenium WebDriver, you would get something like this. So WD has this chained syntax to it. And sorry for the small size on the screen there. So basically, if you were going to automate something through Appium and you wanted to use WD, but you were using Nemo, you could do this, and then you'd have WD available to you in your specs alongside your other specs that maybe just use Selenium itself. So this is basically interacting with the same test application to log in and add a card. So something that comes up a lot when you're doing testing over any large feature or application is, can I run my tests in parallel? It takes me 20 minutes to execute my tests if I run them all one at a time. So Nemo has always had the ability to do parallel tests, but in the past, or actually in the present, what you need to do that is you need grunt plus a grunt task plus a grunt task config plus the Nemo config that we've already looked at. And when I did this, it seemed perfectly fine because what I wanted to make sure of was that Nemo wasn't opinionated about too much. I wanted it to configure the WebDriver and I wanted to allow for plugins, but I wasn't, I wanted some other thing to do the parallelism. And what I had come up with was this grunt and grunt task, which again seemed perfectly fine to me at the time, but a lot of times as an author who's pretty far into the weeds on things, you can think something's pretty usable and good, but then someone else comes along, they're like, no, this is actually pretty difficult. I don't understand what's happening here. So some teams have used this parallel functionality that we have. I think most teams have not, and they just kind of deal with long execution times. And then now we get to Darth Maul. So this guy at PayPal contacted me and had some questions, and then basically the next day he said, well, we're going to go with this other framework, which kind of crushed me for a while. And but we're not trying to be the sort of shop that says you've got to use this tool, you've got to use this thing we invented here, because without competition, you stagnate. So after some reflection about this, it actually, this fellow, Kurt, pinged me a few weeks ago, and he said, well, I'm evaluating Nemo versus this other framework, the same one. So I asked him some leading questions. I said, well, what is it about this other framework that you like so much? And he said, well, you can do parallel testing really easily, and well, how do you do it in Nemo? And I explained it, and he said, that's a lot of config. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, I've got it. So, I mean, it was just that interaction with Kurt that really kind of sparked me to think like a user and say, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't go around with my opinion and tell people that, oh no, it's still better to do it the hard way. It's not a very good sell. So I was like, yeah, you're right. We can put everything in the Nemo configuration. We can throw out the grunt task in the grunt configuration. I still don't want to put a test runner into Nemo, so let me just create a test runner that's called Nemo runner, and then we can fairly easily do parallel testing. So with Nemo runner, you pass it a couple of profiles and a couple of greps, and if you did that, you'd get 4 parallel runs. And based on how you pass commands to it, you can either get a single run or parallel runs, which we'll see in a little bit. Before we do that, I just wanted to talk quickly about sort of test hygiene or mocha hygiene. If possible, it's good to write Selenium tests just like you write unit tests, which means that they all can execute singly by themselves without having to run in a series, or having one test that just does your whole application, like you have an it block and then you've got 400 lines of code that does your whole application. Those are anti-patterns. So to me, the best pattern using Mocha is that you should really, kind of cut your features into small pieces and make sure that your before and after can, set up for any test. So if I wanted to do a, successfully add card, I could do that all by itself. If I wanted to do, should fail to add bank, I can do that all by itself. I shouldn't have to run 3 things to get to that point. And it sounds like common sense, but so often I see that people don't do that I thought I would just throw a slide in there and see if anybody else would commiserate with me about that. Does anyone else use Mocha here? Okay. Same number as people that use Cucumber, it seems like. Okay. So we're going to look at Nemo Runner. We're going to look at this profile section, which is the part of the configuration that matches up with Nemo Runner. So it's being imported. I could have written it inline into the JSON. I just wanted to put it in a separate file for kind of cleanliness. So the base part of the configuration is going to specify your basic whatever you need to do. And in this case, I'm selecting out this particular set of tests. And I'm setting an environment variable so I get some debug information. And then I'm passing a Mocha object with some defaults that I want. And I chose this reporter Mocha Awesome, which makes really nice HTML reports. If you're running in parallel, you need to have some stream of test outputs. You don't want to, if it all comes in one stream, you're not going to be able to tell them apart. So what I did was for each profile, I defined a different report file name. So that if you do run in parallel, you can look afterwards and say, okay, well, what happened with Firefox and this particular, grep argument? And then for iOS, it's kind of a special deal because you're spinning up Appium, and I'm not going to demo that because it takes too long to get a simulator up and running. But the important thing to note here is that I'm accepting the Appium spec from running with the other ones. So instead of using grunt, I'm just using npm scripts, and I'm going to run Nemo Runner via this npm script, and we're calling Firefox and Chrome, and we're going to call the greps for page and view. So that should give us 4 parallel test executions, 2 Firefox and 2 Chrome. And this is with the logging turned on. It's not this verbose if you don't turn it on, but in debugging situations, obviously, you may want to see all this stuff. So we get a failed test. And then we get some information that says we've got some output test files. So I'm just going to scroll up through the object that Nemo Runner gives me back and say, OK, well, it looks like we went in Firefox, and for the page suite, we had some problems. So let's look at that particular report. So we pull that up, and we say, OK, well, here's the problem. This test failed. So in the next demo, we're going to use the async await ability in Node 7 to launch the debugger. So first of all, who recognizes this guy? Poor Doug. Douglas Crockford. Anybody know that name, Doug Crockford? So he's at PayPal, and he gives a lot of talks there, and he's given trainings for everyone that does Node.js at PayPal. And one of the talks he gave, he mentioned that you should avoid abstractions that hide the true nature of a language. And when he said that, I felt very singled out, even though he wasn't talking about me. But the fact that I wrote Nemo and it uses the promise manager, it made me think, you know what? He doesn't know it, but he's talking about me, and he's talking about Selenium WebDriver. So when I heard that the promise manager was going away and that async await was coming in Node 7, I thought, wow, this is an opportunity to kind of undo that unfortunate happenstance with Selenium WebDriver. So what you can get when you do away with the promise manager is you get much nicer debugging. So I see I think we'll have enough time to get through this with time for questions. So we saw that there was a failed test, so let's debug it. Let's use some new features of Node to get a debugger open and the async await to actually hit breakpoints and see where things are going wrong. So I put a debugger keyword here so that we'll stop here. And then if we look in package.json, I've got a debugger script where I'm passing in inspect and debug break, which will, in Node 7 and beyond, open up a Chrome inspector link by default, which is a really nice feature. You don't have to worry about launching a separate process to inspect or debug. So I don't know who's played with this feature yet, but you get a Chrome DevTools type URL that you can plug into Chrome, and then you can start stepping through your code. So it hits the first line, which we're going to move past, and then eventually it'll hit that debugger statement. And for anybody who's used Selenium WebDriver in the past, you know that you can't really do this. You can't just step through on your synchronous looking code. Basically, there's some problem here where it's not automating this select dropdown, and that seems to be some kind of Firefox automation problem. And I didn't get to the bottom of it, but I just wanted to show how easily you could debug using the new features and the lack of the promise manager. And I think briefly I wanted to just show the Nemo object in the debugger. Looks like we're debugging again. OK. Well, I'm going to skip the rest of this because I want to make sure there's some time for questions. But what I did want to, just move past that. So I wanted to leave time for questions if there were any. But before that, I just wanted to say, gratefully from the bottom of my heart, I'm so thankful that you all came to listen and that you spent your valuable time here with me. And I'm grateful and thankful to the to the organizers of this conference, and the people who write Selenium, and the people who I've highlighted in this slide deck as I've gone on. And it's been a great few days in Austin, and I hope you all would agree that it has been. And thank you for your time.